Okay, we're now recording. So, warm welcome to the Summer 2020 Software Preservation Community Quarterly Community Forum. We're so grateful to all of you for showing up today, for your colleagues, and to hear what they've been up to for the last 3 years. Hard to believe. The purpose of these quarterly community forums is to bring together colleagues across professional and disciplinary communities to participate in an hour-long discussion on topics related to software curation, preservation, and reuse. Just quick housekeeping comments. All forums are recorded, and that includes video, audio, and the chat. Audiovisual recordings are uploaded to YouTube, and then the YouTube videos are embedded on the Software Preservation Network website, made openly available to everyone. And we are working on sending out existing recordings for transcription as well, so that those materials are more accessible moving forward. Members of the SPIN staff are going to be checking for questions in the chat, so please at any time, please document that there. We'll also be watching for raised hands and timekeeping. Attendee questions that can't be addressed during this hour-long period will be captured, and we'll do our best to address those offline with our speakers and get that information back to you all. And the questions and answers will be posted on the SPIN website for the discussion roundtable format that we'll be doing today. Zoom ground rules, we just request that everyone keep their microphone muted when you're not speaking. Oftentimes background noise from multiple sources does contribute to poor sound quality. Attendees are also asked to turn their video off until the community Q&A at the end, with the exception of speakers, just in order to preserve bandwidth and, again, quality of the recording. And just one more plug, that if you do have questions or comments, we highly encourage and welcome all of them. And just keep in mind, if you put them in the chat box as you think of them, we will compile them and address them when we get to our Q&A. So without further ado, I just want to acknowledge that as stewards, as a community of practice and as stewards of documentary evidence of our collective memory, we wanted to acknowledge that this is an incredibly challenging time for people across the world, and because we are based in the United States, particularly for Black people in the United States, and the protests that have been going on over the past couple of weeks in response to a long history of systemic racism, which has led to racial inequities and violence. But there's also a lot of hope and traction and momentum that has built to shape a more equitable world moving forward. And so to acknowledge all of the efforts over decades, over centuries of that effort, and more recently seeing some real potential for radical change. And so we just want to point to a few resources at the top of our meeting notes document that you all can feel free to review, at your leisure, or if it's helpful for you. We find these materials to be really excellent compilations of things to educate yourself, and so we just wanted to share these materials with you all. And first and foremost, we encourage you to just take time out to be with yourself as you are able, to care for yourself, so that you have the capacity to be present for other people in your life. And so without further ado, this is a celebration of the work of your colleagues in completing this 3-year project to build organizational capacity in software preservation and emulation. Specifically the Fostering Communities of Practice in Software Preservation and Emulation in Libraries, Archives, and Museums project, what we lovingly call FCOP. Sincerest appreciation and acknowledgement to the Institute for Museum and Library Services, which has funded this project for the last 3 years, and special acknowledgement and thanks to Ashley Sands, our program officer. And so without further ado, I would invite all of the FCOP cohort team members on the line to introduce themselves, starting with the University of Arizona. Let's see.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, go ahead, Monique.
Oh, hi, everyone. Actually, Fernando, you can go ahead first, because you're at University of Arizona. So.
Okay. So I'm Fernando Rios. I'm the Research Data Management Specialist at the University of Arizona. And I worked on the FCOP project with Monique.
Hi, I'm Monique Lasser. I used to work at University of Arizona during the duration of this grant project. Now I'm at Harvard, but I was the project lead for this project.
Thank you so much. And Cindy, are you on the line? I want to point out to everyone, as Monique has pointed out, that people move on and organizations evolve. And so Monique has sent huge congratulations to moving to Harvard University this year. And we've also had some other job changes. So I'll invite Cindy and Jonathan as well to point those out. Cindy, can you introduce yourself for your time at Living Computer Museums?
Sure, I'm Cindy Moya. I don't have a webcam right now. I was software preservation manager at Living Computers Museum and Labs and led the team with the FCOP project trying to get some middle-aged emulators onto EASY. And now I am working with Swinburne University of Technology on projects that are directly related to using emulation as a service to deploy artworks and video games. So,
thank you so much, Cindy. Let's see, Tracy and the team from University of Illinois.
Hi there, I'm Tracy Popp. I'm Digital Preservation Coordinator at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign.
Thank you, Tracy. University of Virginia.
Hi everyone, I'm Lauren Work. I'm the Digital Preservation Librarian at UVA, and I was the project lead for our FCOP project at the university.
Thank you, Lauren. Let's see, Jonathan, are you on the call?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm Jonathan Farbowitz. For a significant duration of the FCOP project, I was the fellow in the conservation of computer-based art at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. But yes, I like Monique, I've also moved on to a different position. I'm currently the Associate Conservator of Time-Based Media at the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Yes, sincerest congratulations to Jonathan, Cindy, and Monique once again for their new roles. And then let's see, Wendy, Georgia Tech.
Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Hagenmeyer. I'm the Digital Collections Archivist at Georgia Tech in Atlanta and have been the lead for our team at Georgia Tech.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I'll just briefly point that the members of the project team include Zach Vowell at Cal Poly University, Matt Schultz at Educopia, myself, Jessica Meyerson at Educopia, Amelia Acker, who will have a longer introduction shortly that Wendy will provide, and Kelly Pendergrast, who we're working with on communication strategy, who is the co-founder of Anti-Static, which is a communications and policy consultancy. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to Wendy.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I want to jump in sort of where Jessica left off and just explain a little bit about how our project has worked, how this cohort has worked, and then we'll jump into the discussion. As Jessica explained, the overall goal of the FCOP, or Fostering Community of Practice, has been to broaden participation in software preservation through a cohort model and move towards advancing digital preservation practice and informing field-wide understanding of some of the challenges to providing access to software-dependent cultural heritage. The project was spearheaded by Zach Vowell of Cal Poly, who serves as the PI. Hey, Zach. And Jessica Meyerson of Educopia, who has served as our community cultivation advisor, with key facilitation support from Matt Schultz and research by Dr. Amelia Acker. And our cohort consists of 6 software preservation and emulation project teams who you just met briefly. And we've all utilized an emulation sandbox hosted by Yale with key technical support from Klaus Records of OpenSLX. The original grant called for a cohort of 6 software preservationists, and there was a call for proposals from teams in late 2017 with the goal of recruiting a diverse set of perspectives across the cultural heritage domains of libraries, archives, and museums together. The idea was that 6 sites would provide enough variation among different types of organizations and projects that we might have some basis for comparison and contrast. And the goal was to sort of foster relationships between cohort members so that a community of practice could continue to grow beyond the project end date. So each project lead has served as a point of contact for the cohort, participated in project activities such as in-person kickoff, capstone meeting, monthly project calls. We also had bi-monthly like pair calls with 2 different organizations together, as well as public presentations and outreach, and you'll hear more about that. And in addition to the project lead, each team has included at least 2 additional staff that share some responsibility for existing born digital content or digital curation infrastructure or access tools and systems or workflows or sort of policies within the organization. Trying to think of what else. So yeah, just in general, our cohort has really benefited from community fellowship and sharing our challenges as we've gone along, as well as financial support for doing outreach activities and presentations, and access to the web-based emulation sandbox. And I think as we sort of reflected during a presentation at Code for Lib this past spring, through sort of shared knowledge and questions and measurement, we've done more to build momentum for software preservation within our organizations and as a community sort of than any one of us could have done alone. So we'll talk more about everything during the panel. So let's just go ahead and dig in. And I'm excited to introduce Dr. Acker so that she can provide an overview of her work as the FCOP project researcher and how she's thinking about this growing community of practice through the lens of interdisciplinary social science. So take it away, Amelia.
Okay, thank you so much, Wendy, for that introduction. So great to see everyone on the call today. Really excited to have this roundtable discussion with everyone. Last summer, I spent time observing 3 of the teams carry out their emulation projects at different sites, Living Computers Museum and Labs with Cindy, RetroTech at Georgia Tech, Libraries with Wendy, and UVA Libraries with Lauren. And I embedded for about 3 working days at each of these sites where I sort of interviewed team members, observed meetings, and learned more about software emulation in place. So today I'm going to report out some of the emerging research trends that I found and that will appear in some of the forthcoming articles that we're writing and open educational resources that we're going to be publishing later this year. So the first theme that I observed across all sites and in meetings and many interviews with project participants is the sheer variety of emulation practices and techniques, applications that we see across libraries, archives, and museums. And we know from other research on digital preservation strategies that these kinds of practices each have particular visions of access that are embedded or motivating these preservation projects. And so these visions of access may come from the institutional mandate where the emulation service is being provided, the individual members who are providing access or leading the project, or even the tools and resources themselves that are selected in order to support intended use cases. And I describe some of these practices sort of as nested and interconnected. And these different emulation practices are emulation for preservation, emulation for archival access, as you might do in research, and then emulation for exhibition and display. These different kinds of emulation practices bring us to the next sort of key finding about finding from the research, which is encounters with emulation. So one of the most fun experiences for me as a researcher was hanging out in these different spaces at these different sites and observing these different encounters that one might have as a researcher, as a patron, as a teacher or student, accessing software-dependent information media.
Oh, Doris, come out.
Oh, is Doris okay? Okay, I'll keep going. Me, myself, I'm still a pretty novice user when it comes to sort of older software and accessing it. So I didn't know much about accessing information through emulation before I showed up last summer to start the research. But what a lot of these embedded field site visits revealed to me, and I expect that we'll hear more about this in our roundtable discussion in a few minutes, is that emulation practices are not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. So the reality of users in place, who they are, what they need, and how we communicate our access goals, those really shape or figures, maybe even prefigure the possible emulation encounters that we can provide to different users depending on where they're located. So whether that's your daily work as a collections curator, day in, day out, or whether you're a graduate student at home trying to develop or build a great dissertation idea, or whether you're visiting a space or just walking past an exhibit or an interactive display, these will impact your emulation encounters. So what this means is that emulation strategies, those different kinds of practices that I discussed at the top, need to support a variety of different kinds of encounters for folks, whether you're using it in your daily work as a preservationist, whether you're using it for an intensive research visit, or whether it's just for an afternoon visiting a place or experiencing cultural heritage. So this last theme that I want to share with you today that I encountered throughout this research is actually how to communicate emulation services to our stakeholders, whether that's users, whether that's our managers, or even our funders. One area that we really need to think together, and maybe we'll talk more about this today, is building a language around what we do and what we're seeing as we implement these new preservation programs and digital curation strategies. And communicating emulation as a service provision in our institution, to me, sort of as an information scientist, is important, but also as an LIS educator is really important when we think about our professional and research communities, because we need accurate language to describe what we're doing when we're designing service provisions and when we're teaching future information professionals how to manage and implement those as well. So whether we're undertaking emulation to preserve software, to access software-dependent data for archival research, or to replicate an encounter for an exhibit display, we need to be able to describe these practices precisely and accurately, because that's really important for measuring the success of implementing programs. It's important for accountability and transparency, so best practices around our labor and our work. And it's also important for being understood by people who may not be information professionals, but would benefit from understanding these access points in order to sort of witness software as part of our digital cultural heritage. So those are some of the key points and thoughts that I wanted to share with everyone today. And now we're going to transition to our roundtable discussion. We're going to try a sort of a different format where I put on my interviewer hat once again, and I engage with some of the cohort members in conversation about their experiences, their challenges, insights, and takeaways, and what they want all of you to know about building capacity for software preservation and emulation. Okay, so our first interviewees are going to be Monique and Jonathan. We all ready? Yeah, I see you guys. So in the past couple of months and years together, we've talked about building a shared vocabulary around software preservation and emulation activities. And that's actually used in the official name of the FCOP cohort. So we're interested in understanding this shared vocabulary that bridges both epistemic and professional communities in terms of digital stewards and researchers. And so Monique and Jonathan, could you tell us a little bit about how those two terms, software preservation and software emulation, have informed the way that you designed your individual projects as well as your software preservation activities moving forward?
Sure, I can start a little bit with software preservation specifically. I think, and I might kind of meld a couple of the questions, but software preservation in particular, I think prior to the project was a lot more, at least for me, that definition was geared more towards code, kind of agnostic of like the actual storage medium. And for this project, we were working with Commodore games. So we were working with removable media, floppy disks. And so, the way that we had to preserve these objects, how crucial it was to get like a control over kind of the rendering equipment and then the necessary equipment to actually image the media really changed my perception of kind of, or my definition of software preservation, and also informed our project and kind of the cadence of it. Because a lot of the project for us was kind of getting control over the physical aspects, the more physical aspects, the gaming console. And in particular, the partners that we work with, the Learning Games Initiative Research Archive, the way that they provide access to their games is through use. So they try to lend out the equipment as much as they can so that people can actually run the game on the original rendering equipment. And so that really informed the way that we approached preserving the objects that we, the games in our project. And I think for that reason, emulation, while it was always the goal, emulation was kind of very hard for us to actually kind of complete or get to because of how much time we spent with the storage medium and working with the different peripheral equipment. And I can't really speak to how this project in specific would affect software preservation activities at Arizona. But just based on my experience there and my position, I would say that it really forced us to kind of look at the necessary work to get a handle on the preservation aspect and what it would take to have that be more programmatic and more efficient.
Thanks, Monique. Jonathan, did you want to answer?
Yeah,
Mike?
sure. So I wanted to say the Guggenheim was the only art museum in the cohort. So we were in a pretty unique position in terms of how we thought about, how people would get access to the software in our collection. We were basically dealing with software-based artworks. And so like Monique at University of Arizona, we were also dealing with a lot of physical materials as well. Like artists provided computers, artists provided hardware. A lot of artworks, especially installation artworks, use a lot of custom hardware and custom code. So actually that was part of our original proposal for the project, is that the idea that with artworks, you're dealing with a lot of non-commercial software. So how do you kind of wrap your mind and think about how you might treat that different from commercial, software like Microsoft Word, something like that. What we thought about in terms of emulation, and I think that we discovered more and more through this project, is just in terms of emulation, there are a lot of factors to consider in terms of fidelity to the artwork, because our use case for emulation would be basically running the artist code independent of the original hardware. And there's just so many variables in terms of how the artist originally set up their piece to run. So yeah, we found that this is an area that is very promising. I mean, we're not going to be able to replace legacy hardware forever. So art museums do definitely need to turn toward emulation and virtualization as ways to exhibit historic artworks. It's just a matter of kind of figuring out how we can tweak those systems to serve us. I know one of the other proposals of our project was to try to figure out what type of metadata, how much technical information you might need to document about an artwork before you can feel confident that you can steward that into the future. And I don't know if we had a full conclusion on that, but it's certainly something to consider because there's so much technical information that you can gather about all of this equipment and all this software, but like what's really the important stuff to save, because we only have so much time, so we're limited in that regard. But yeah, it's been interesting to think about all of those questions.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you, Jonathan, for those answers. Let's move on to some questions about user experiences. These will be directed to Tracy and Cindy. You guys ready?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So our first question is, what are the software preservation and emulation use cases that align most closely with your organization's strategic priorities? Where does the software that you're collecting come from? What creator communities? And who are your user communities that you serve?
So I can start. So I would say that software preservation and emulation primarily align, with a lot of my preservation use or moving forward with collections that have complex content. So I'm looking at, initially looking at using emulation for, running specifically in this project. It was looking at complex musical production and creation software environments, and moving forward with identifying those environments, identifying what aspects of the software are important to retain in order to provide the necessary information to kind of unpack and adequately and appropriately understand that content and the sort of creation environment. The software itself has come through a variety of means. I have been able to capture it through acquisition of collections at the time of acquisition, through recovery, using digital forensics techniques of either replicating a complete computing environment or something like that, and then purchasing or trying to identify where I can purchase software running from I had collections that I was focusing on that spanned from mid 90s through the late 20 or early 20 teens. So in terms of technological variation, just even within a single software title, it's an incredible span of change and upgrades and that kind of thing. So with kind of thinking about that, the goal is perhaps I think in the future is to have more user access to the files themselves, or to an adequate representation of the files. So with that, it's been my kind of thinking about how we provide that access, or who needs to be involved, or what level of additional knowledge do they need, what is important to gather from a creator or donor at the time of acquisition. So again, kind of thinking about my project within FCOP, each different collection that I looked at had a variety of donor engagement or information from the donor, and one of which was a donor was still with us and engaged and very interested in the process, and he was able to provide additional contextual information about his creation process that really helped us kind of understand what how to adjust or represent his collections in a way that would provide that accurate sort of representation to users. So, and that also too is another variation of, availability of donors or how much information there is existing about a collection, to think about how much contextual information I might have to provide or we might have to look into in order to render that content or display it or, have that, again, appropriate and accurate representation.
Great, thank you, Tracy. Cindy, would you like to respond to that question?
Let me unmute myself. Well, at Living Computers Museum and Labs, their overriding concern was to have working computers that people could use both on-site and online from, say, the 60s to the 90s. There was a great deal of engineering going on there to integrate emulators of all sorts into the working of the museum and stuff. So emulation as a service was just kind of a side treat to the main focus of the museum, which, and what we were trying to do with our project was to bring in a couple of in-house emulators, one for the Contralto, one for Multics, one for the Xerox Star, and get it running on emulation as a service. And at the time, although Klaus was able to make it work, there was something about the stacking of containers that made it very slow. And I did switch my focus to later emulators like the IBM 5150, the Commodore 64, and the Apple I, Apple II, things like that. So the early 8-bit computers, and got a lot of traction on that. And, like Monique's problem, right? They spent a lot of time just trying to get disk drives to work. And the museum, we had this incredible collection of like lots of disk drives and lots of disks and engineers who were really interested and able to make the things go and understood the deep guts of the thing. So that was really nice. We say our collection, the software collection, it was like a deluge. Right? We took donations and also purchased things, and in formats from punch paper tape, punch cards, discs, stat tapes, disc packs, like all this weird, funny media that's hard to describe, and there's not good taxonomies for it, but just trying to get a handle on that and describe it and put it away safely was a big issue. It was different from dealing with, it was hard to deal with an individual donor as like a specific thing, the way that maybe the Guggenheim and a time-based piece of art that you could spend a whole lot of time on is one way of doing it. But we had to really figure out ways to do it at scale with just, this deluge of stuff. And the user communities was, it's really diverse. There's a lot of hobbyists, people who are just really, for some reason or another, really interested in vintage computers. People who were involved in the development of these languages who just continued following on or interested in the old computers, stuff like that. And also students. We deploy this stuff a lot for, they drove a lot of kids through field trips, hundreds of them a week, and trying to give them a meaningful experience with these vintage, computers from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that might stick with them more than just like, woo, So there was a very diverse community like that. And the emulation as a service, again, was a very small part, but it was a lot of fun.
Great, thank you, Cindy. So I have a follow-up question, and that's actually about the differences between providing access to data versus providing access to an experience. Did you, Tracy or Cindy, did you noticed this throughout your project, and how you're thinking through what are the different ways that we need to provide access to experience, and how does that really impact the amount of contextual information that you provide to those people who want to access that software emulation?
So yeah, I mean, there is, you know, a difference of thinking about access to just, you know, providing access to the information versus kind of understanding holistically either the experience of using that or using or engaging with the files itself as well as the software. So I did, you know, I have considered that, and that is a point of thinking about how much additional information we need, how much are we expecting our users as well as our curators to understand about the software environment itself and how to operate and engage with that content. You know, so there's thinking about, again, with thinking about complex recording software environments. There's a lot of moving parts to those titles, and you know, it's a balance of trying to find, you know, again, of like what is adequate, what is, you know, how do we prioritize our time, and how much are we expecting a user to know about this or have an understanding to kind of get enough of functionality to get at the content itself. So, you know, that's still kind of an ongoing and will likely continue over time. My thought is trying to gather documentation or knowledge around a title when it's available, you know, retaining manuals and other sort of contextual information with the software object itself, so that in the future when, say, you know, the latest version of Pro Tools is not at the vanguard of audio recording, somebody might have a little bit more understanding of like some of the unique conditions of operating that version of the software, you know. But yeah, it's just kind of that balance of understanding use, time, prioritization, that kind of thing.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Cindy, what about you? Did you kind of work through some of these questions, ideas about whether to spend more time on sort of data or thinking more about emulating for the experience?
Well, the museum collection started out as, you know, technical documents, software, drawings to help the engineers restore the old computers. So that was, again, an access to experience, I think, more than data. But there, you know, the museum really started out as Paul Allen, the founder, his desire to read out a deck tape that had his original Altair Basic on it. And in order to do that, they had to restore a computer, restore a tape drive, get a printer, all running to do that. So again, that was access to data to begin with. So the services of the museum, although people would come there and say, can you read this disc for us? We could never really put together a service that would help the general public read their data. But that, they have done a number of specialized things for, again, hobbyists, scholars, allied, and computer geeky people. But generally, it was access to experience for the users who come walking in. And we had to do a lot of, you know, people would be faced with this computer and have no idea what to do with it. So we started putting books down there that, you know, introductory books. How do you use the CP/M? How do you use DOS? And also make some stand-ups that gave people a little experience that they could walk through. Like, click here, do that, try another thing, to get them into it.
Great, thank you, Cindy. Okay, these last few questions are for Lauren and Wendy. Are you with us? Great, see you. So this cohort has spent the last couple of years together sharing and comparing institutional practices. Given that software preservation is still really in its early stages and you all represent notably really different institutional contexts, what challenges and priorities for action have you both identified in common, and how can other organizations that may be in very different in terms of structure and culture apply what you've learned in a more generalized way? Who wants to go first?
Go for it, Lauren.
Sure. Yeah, I think one thing that folks, have already talked about in their answers to some of your other questions are the kind of wide range of, challenges in adapting existing workflows, kind of taking a look at how you're thinking about integrating software emulation practice into no matter, what your institution is, whether it's, a museum that's focused more on artwork or an academic library. So on my end, this was based out of an archival structure. So we were looking at what we called our project Emulation in the Archives, which is kind of a specific subset of, library access. We have reading room access and, kind of special collections and archives workflows. So one thing that we identified and in talking with the cohort over the course of the 2 years was taking an approach to kind of integrating and adapting existing workflows to address things around software curation and software preservation. So for example, I know at UVA, speaking to our, kind of infrastructure there, we adopted this kind of just-in-time practice around, okay, what already exists that we can kind of integrate with software preservation. So this included things like taking a look at our deed of gift. Does this involve, language? Speaking to Amelia's earlier point, Dr. Actor's earlier point around communication. So do folks even know the questions to ask when they're thinking about bringing in materials? What kinds of questions should those be, and how can we inform those around what we've learned, but we need on the preservation side to actually then provide access either via emulation or other means. So can you take a look at how you're describing materials, how you're inventorying things, what approaches you're taking? That's another thing, from this experience that I think is a shared challenge of how is the work distributed and understood to contribute to things like software preservation. So one other example before I throw to Wendy that we tried to take on just in our institutional context that I think folks could adapt was how can we leverage existing description for things like commercial software, which was our institutional context for our use case. So what exists for institutional commercial-based software, there was MARC metadata that we leveraged to then kind of form the shape around how we described software in an archival context. So taking a look at what exists, having conversations, sharing language, and then kind of shaping workflows to then adapt to the work that needs to be done for software preservation was something that, we identified, I think, as a cohort of ways that we adapted and adopted how this work fits in, regardless of your institution. And I'll throw to Wendy now for her answer.
Yeah, I think just building on, Lauren, what you've said, that shared challenge I've experienced directly, and I think, a lot of us in the cohort have experienced, is sort of realizing how software preservation actually includes sort of people and systems at every step of the digital curation / archives life cycle. So like Lauren, you were talking about, the point of acquisition, thinking about appraisal, thinking about description, thinking about preservation, and then certainly in our case, access and reuse. So our project at Georgia Tech was really focused on what we sort of were calling the software story, or telling the story around some software related projects that have occurred at Georgia Tech, and how might those be invitations for jumping into this work. And exploring what the possibilities might be for us with software preservation. And so we were really focused on collecting as well as access. We sort of were determined to eventually provide access during this project to those stories. So as a result, the more I started to see that software preservation touches each piece of the workflow, the more I wanted, to create good metadata, for example, like following Lauren's example, but that just wasn't sort of the focus of our project. We were really focused on the sort of beginning and end of the life cycle, if you might say that acquisition and access would be those points. So really shared challenge being that software preservation is the whole life cycle, and that sometimes we can't do the whole life cycle well, or we can't do everything, and that's okay. And that's part of the value of working in a cohort. Is I knew when we were done that I could really study Lauren's metadata work and we could get there. And so sort of, I guess, part of that challenge is, dumping in where you can, handling what you can, and then leveraging what is coming out of the community to fill those gaps in the life cycle. And I think also, just more concretely, we've identified some shared challenges of like areas of software genre, for example, where we might collaborate, or opportunities for collaboration. So even just in the cohort, like Lauren and I were both interested in architectural software and that use case. There was also shared interest in the games use case within our cohort. And so really gathering knowledge and skills around those different genres is really an opportunity for the field, I think. And I think one more shared challenge that we talked a lot about in our final capstone meeting was just sort of like how to make decisions about the cost benefit of this work, and sort of how much time is it worth? How many people can be invested? How does this affect decisions about digital infrastructure? And sort of measuring that cost benefit is a challenge, especially because it does affect the whole life cycle.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Lauren, for those answers. I think I'm going to open up the floor to all of our FCOP members now and ask you, would you please share maybe the most important takeaway that you have from having participated in this project that you'd like to share with our community today? Who wants to go first?
Well, I guess kind of following with Wendy's points on, there's a lot more involved, a lot more people involved in software preservation and emulation than one might initially consider. So it's been really an educational experience in identifying how to scale the work and identify where we can gather information and get other folks involved throughout this work.
Thank you, Tracy. Who would like to go next?
I'll go next. This is Cindy. I think that emulation as a service and EaaSI both generate a lot of interest out there amongst archivists, preservationists, users. People are really, really interested in it and want to find out more. And, being a part of this project, which was just a small part of my job at Living Computers, netted me this very interesting postdoctoral fellowship with Melanie Swalwell at Swinburne University of Technology, where we are going to be depending on emulation as a service to present these Australian video games of the 90s and Australian media art at the Acme Museum and Swinburne University of Technology. So I think this is a great project, and it's complicated and hard to learn, but it's worth taking the time to learn how to do it because it's going to keep becoming more and more interesting to other people, and is a great utility for presenting old software, preserving it, showing it to people, users. So.
Thank you, Cindy. Who's next?
I can go next. I would say for me, there are kind of two things, but just really quickly, you know, based on the amount of work that it takes to really get to the end point, I think this project has kind of hit home again, the point that is to like be incredibly intentional about what needs to be accessed in which way. Does everything, like what really needs to be emulated, what really needs to retain that fidelity, what objects need that, because it's just too much work for usually like the institutions with, you know, not many resources. And then the second point is really just kind of speaking to Cindy's a little bit, is that EAS is really, I think it's like really crucial for our field, for many different like kind of subdisciplines, and especially for like my current role now as a digital archivist in special collections, needing to provide access to these files within a reading room, kind of like in a mediated way, but also like needing to increase access beyond the reading room. I think EAS, like potentially this sort of kind of model, this sort of infrastructure could be really, it's really important for us, especially given like our current limitations with, you know, being around each other. So I look forward to seeing what happens in the future with this.
Thank you, Monique. Who's next?
I can go. I think my biggest takeaway is the holistic nature of this work, and you know, people talk about it, but you could really feel it in this project. Like we had to have, you know, we have to think about work with technologists and programmers, work with legal experts, you know, people in all different areas supporting this work. So it really shows that training in software preservation has to be, you know, a very broad-based education to be able to interact with all of these different people. And the idea that, you know, where the digital preservation experts or the software preservation experts, and we have to know everything about everything is not only impossible, it's just not really going to work that way within the institutions, I think. So that, I think, was my main takeaway. But I also just wanted to echo the other cohort members' support of EAS as a really, you know, a really good potential solution for some of the issues that we're dealing with. Especially the idea that you could have like base environments of very standard operating systems from different eras and share those across institutions, which I think would also help the museum world as well.
Great, thank you so much, Jonathan. Anyone else?
I'll jump in. I think building on what everyone has said, my biggest takeaway, or sort of what I'm thinking a lot about right now, is sort of the who of software preservation. You know, as folks have been saying, the people, like who are we doing this for and why? Who's in the room and who's not? And I think, you know, that sort of, we started our project with a documentation strategy, and I am aware that we have a long way to go in using software preservation as an occasion for really digging into that strategy. So that's where I want to go next, but really just thinking about the people in the work.
And I'll jump in real quick. I did see that Fernando had a nice ad in the chat. So if folks haven't looked at that, he was talking about the gap in educational aspects of talking with folks about this. And that's something I wanted to highlight too. I know we've kind of touched on these things, but something that stuck out for me, we all kind of wrote our use cases based on, you know, our institutional context and maybe the collections we had, but something that grew out of this that was really impactful for me speaks to what everybody has touched on, which is who are we doing this for? And I thought Arizona and Georgia Tech in particular did a great job during the course of their work to kind of form and talk with localized user and interest groups. And I highly encourage folks who are thinking about this work. There's a lot that will kind of emerge, you know, you think you have some use cases, and even on the archive side, We thought we came in with an architectural use case, and then in the course of actually thinking carefully, talking with people about this work, you find other software and software dependent collections or interest groups, you know, that are around. So that's something that stuck out for me, was the work to be done and talking and building cohorts within cohorts within cohorts of interest groups. And Cindy and Jonathan also touched on this in their respective use cases. But yeah, and then as a preservationist, you know, all these components we've been talking about have similar lines to preservation. You know, it's not just one person who can do this. It's a collaborative effort that stems sometimes in one person taking images or, you know, looking for the metadata around dependencies for particular environments. But similar to the importance of EAAS as a browser-based, you know, emulation structure that hopefully in future can expand beyond reading rooms, there's that whole collaborative aspect of understanding the nature of the work and being able to talk about it in a way that enhances the collaboration we need to get to that emulation piece. So I'll stop there, but.
Great, thank you so much. I think I'm gonna hand it off to Jessica, okay?
Yeah, I'm blown away always by my colleagues, and I feel so privileged truly to have worked alongside each and every person that is on the call that is part of these teams, as well as the project lead, the leadership who was represented in the roundtable today. And huge thanks to Amelia for bringing all of her expertise and experience and her lens as an information scientist to this work. I really can't say thank you enough to everyone. I've learned so much. I hope that this was informative and generative for all of the attendees today on the meeting. I'll just note, we don't have time for questions because I want to make sure that we get out. I'm not seeing too much in the chat. I know it's a lot to process, and I just want to offer up more of an invitation as we close out today's quarterly community forum, which is, there's so much effort described today and really thoughtfulness and creativity that has been documented but is not currently shared on the FCOP website. We are working with Kelly Pendergrass from Anti-Static to pull together and package up all of the artifacts, the reflections, the stories, actual institutional documentation, and also the project team and Amelia's efforts to try and provide a few index points into that work. And so, as Amelia mentioned, you know, we'll be seeing these deliverables come out for the rest of June. You all, you know, keep an eye out on listservs and on social media. And just want to say huge thanks again, and a celebratory thank you to this entire group. And Brandon has posted something into the chat in terms of the urgency, just reiterating Monique's comment that the work that's been discussed today seems particularly timely in terms of the fact that we are, you know, alone together, to use Sherry Turkle's title, and there's more and more emphasis on providing off-premises access to these software-dependent materials. So thank you for that, Brandon, and just closing up with, again, a very sincere thanks and an invitation to engage more in this work with us. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and thank you again.